What if the fathers you trusted most on television were hiding the biggest secrets of all? The steady wisdom of Leave It to Beaver and the perfect guidance of Father Knows Best shaped a generation. But behind those roles, some lived lives they couldn't reveal. In a time when truth could end a career, silence became survival, and the cost was deeply personal. In this video, we uncover the hidden stories, the pressure, and the reality behind America's most beloved TV dads. Robert Reed, The Brady Bunch. Robert Reed remains one of the most striking examples of how a carefully crafted television image can differ from a person's private reality. In his role as Mike Brady on The Brady Bunch, Reed came to embody the ideal American father, calm, wise, and dependable. For many viewers, especially families across the United States, he represented stability and warmth during a changing era. Yet behind the scenes, Reed often struggled with the show's overly sweet tone. Trained in serious theater, he frequently disagreed with creator Sherwood Schwartz, believing some storylines lacked depth and realism. He approached even simple sitcom scenes with the discipline of stage acting, which sometimes created tension on set but also reflected his commitment to his craft. Privately, Reed was living a life that could not be openly acknowledged at the time. During the show's run, he maintained a long-term relationship with a male partner, something that, in that era, had to remain hidden due to widespread social stigma. Earlier in life, he had been married and had a daughter, but that chapter ended quietly. By the 1970s, Reed found moments of freedom in Los Angeles's more discreet social circles, where he could be himself away from public scrutiny. His co-stars were aware, but out of respect and the norms of the time, nothing was publicly discussed. Florence Henderson later described him as a tortured soul, suggesting that the emotional strain he carried often translated into his intense professionalism. When Reed passed away in 1992 from complications related to colon cancer, it was also revealed that he was living with HIV, news that deeply surprised fans who still saw him as television's perfect dad. Robert Young, Father Knows Best. Robert Young stands as another powerful example of how television images can sharply contrast with private reality. In his role as Jim Anderson on Father Knows Best, he became the embodiment of the ideal 1950s father, calm, thoughtful, and unwaveringly wise. Week after week, he portrayed a man who resolved family conflicts with patience and quiet authority, rarely raising his voice unless it served a meaningful lesson. Audiences trusted him, and multiple awards only reinforced the belief that Young truly represented the gold standard of American fatherhood. Off-screen, however, his life told a very different story. Young struggled deeply with severe depression and alcoholism, battles that led to repeated hospitalizations over the years. At a time when mental health was rarely discussed openly, studio publicists worked carefully to shield the public from any sign of instability. Reports indicate that even a self-harm incident was kept out of the spotlight, as such revelations could have damaged the wholesome image so central to his career. The contrast between his public and private life was profound. While he portrayed stability and emotional control, he was quietly dealing with inner turmoil that few people fully understood. Maintaining that divide was not only difficult, it was emotionally draining. Some biographers have speculated about the nature of certain close relationships in his life, but there is no solid evidence to confirm those claims. What is clearly documented, however, is his dependence on alcohol and his need for psychiatric care, both carefully managed behind the scenes. Raymond Burr. Raymond Burr's story stands out for the extraordinary lengths he went to in order to protect his private life, so much so that it reshaped how the public saw him for decades. On screen, he built a commanding presence as the brilliant defense attorney in Perry Mason, and later as the determined, wheelchair-using detective in Ironside. In both roles, Burr projected authority, intelligence, and unwavering control, qualities audiences came to trust completely. Off-screen, however, the story was far more complicated. Burr maintained a deeply private personal life during a time when public scrutiny could easily damage a career. To explain his lack of a visible romantic life, he repeated a tragic story about a wife and child who had supposedly died in a plane crash. Biographers later determined that this account was not factual, but rather a carefully constructed narrative, likely intended to deflect attention and preserve his public image. In reality, Burr shared a long-term relationship with actor Robert Benavides that lasted over 3 decades. Together, they built a life that included travel, business ventures, most notably an orchid enterprise, and a quiet domestic partnership. Despite this, studio publicity practices of the era ensured that such details remained out of sight, sometimes even arranging photographs to support a more conventional image. When Burr passed away in 1993, Benavides was often referred to only in professional terms in public notices, reflecting the continued reluctance of that time to fully acknowledge their relationship. Dick Sargent, Bewitched. Dick Sargent holds a unique place in television history, not only for his work on screen, but for the quiet courage he showed later in life. When he stepped into the role of Darren Stevens on Bewitched, replacing Dick York, he inherited a character already beloved by millions. As the dependable all-American husband to a magical wife, Sargent helped maintain the show's familiar warmth and charm during its later seasons. Yet behind that polished image, Sargent lived with a constant need for caution. In an era when Hollywood expected strict conformity, he was advised to keep his personal life out of view. Like many actors of his generation, he followed that guidance closely, limiting public appearances, avoiding speculation, and carefully managing how he was perceived. The pressure to remain silent was not unusual for the time, but it came at a personal cost. Everything changed in 1991. Approaching 60, and as the AIDS crisis was devastating communities across the country, Sargent made a decision that set him apart. In a televised interview on Entertainment Tonight, he publicly came out as gay. For many viewers, especially those who had grown up watching him, this was a surprising and significant moment, not because it was unimaginable, but because few men of his era had spoken so openly. In the years that followed, Sargent became an advocate, participating in public events, fundraisers, and awareness campaigns. His presence carried weight. He represented a generation that had long been asked to stay quiet, now choosing to speak. When he passed away in 1994, he was remembered not only as a familiar television figure, but as someone who, in his later years, chose honesty and visibility over silence. Paul Lynde, The Paul Lynde Show / Hollywood Squares. Paul Lynde remains one of television's most distinctive comedic voices, quick-witted, sharp, and instantly recognizable. As a regular on Hollywood Squares, his biting humor and impeccable timing made him a household name. Audiences laughed at his playful sarcasm, but there was always a sense that his persona carried more beneath the surface than what was openly acknowledged. That tension became especially clear with The Paul Lynde Show, where producers attempted to cast him as a conventional suburban father. The role, designed to present a familiar, wholesome image, never quite fit. Viewers could feel the disconnect. Lynde's expressive delivery, his raised eyebrows, his knowing pauses, often undercut the very normalcy the show tried to project. The series was short-lived, in part because that contrast proved difficult to reconcile. Off-camera, Lynde lived in a very different reality. Among close friends, he was more open about who he was, but professionally, he worked in an environment that often reduced his identity to subtext or stereotype. The pressure to entertain while remaining silent about his personal life contributed to a deep sense of isolation. Colleagues later described him as struggling with loneliness and heavy drinking, suggesting that the laughter audiences loved sometimes masked personal pain. One widely reported incident in 1965, when a young man died after falling from a hotel window where Lynde was present, cast a long shadow over his life, though no charges were filed and details remained unclear. Sebastian Cabot, Family Affair. Sebastian Cabot brought a sense of dignity and refinement to every role he played, but it was his portrayal of Mr. French on Family Affair that made him especially memorable to American audiences. With his commanding presence and smooth, unmistakable British voice, Cabot seemed perfectly cast as the proper, devoted butler. Steady, loyal, and quietly wise. For many viewers, he embodied a kind of old-world grace that felt both reassuring and timeless. Yet, as with many performers of his era, Cabot kept his personal life largely out of public view. He never married and rarely spoke about his private relationships in interviews, choosing instead to maintain a clear boundary between his professional image and his off-screen world. In a time when public expectations were rigid and often unforgiving, such discretion was not unusual, but it did invite curiosity. Gossip columns and industry chatter occasionally speculated about his personal life, though little was ever confirmed. Within certain Hollywood circles, there were quiet assumptions about his companionship, but these remained just that, unverified and rarely discussed openly. Cabot himself deflected attention with humor, often making light of his love of food, once joking that it was his only real vice. That self-deprecating wit helped him redirect focus away from more personal questions, allowing him to preserve the composed image audiences knew. When Cabot passed away in 1977, tributes rightly celebrated his distinguished career and the memorable characters he brought to life. At the same time, they revealed very little about the man behind those roles, reflecting both his own preference for privacy and the conventions of an earlier Hollywood era. William Frawley, I Love Lucy / My Three Sons. William Frawley is best remembered for bringing Fred Mertz to life on I Love Lucy, a role that made him a familiar face in households across America. With his gruff humor and sharp delivery, he created a character who felt both irritable and endearing, a perfect counterbalance to the show's energy. He later continued his television success on My Three Sons, further cementing his place in classic TV history. Behind that comedic persona, however, Frawley's personal life was far less lighthearted. He had a long reputation for heavy drinking and a difficult temperament, traits that sometimes strained his relationships with colleagues. Stories from those who worked with him often described a man who could be sharp and combative, using humor as both a weapon and a shield. Over time, this reputation contributed to a sense of distance between him and others in the industry. Frawley's marriage ended after only a few years, and he never remarried. Like many figures from early Hollywood, his private life became the subject of occasional speculation, including unverified rumors about past relationships. However, there is no solid evidence to support those claims. What is clear is that, in his later years, he lived a quieter and increasingly isolated life. In 1966, Frawley suffered a fatal heart attack on a Hollywood street, bringing a sudden end to a career that had spanned decades. While audiences remember the laughter he helped create, those who looked more closely also saw a man who carried personal struggles behind the scenes. His story reflects a familiar pattern from that era, public warmth and humor, often contrasted with private hardship. Hugh Beaumont, Leave It to Beaver. Hugh Beaumont became a symbol of steady, thoughtful fatherhood through his role as Ward Cleaver on Leave It to Beaver. Week after week, he portrayed a calm, principled parent, offering guidance with patience and quiet authority. For many American families, especially in the late 1950s and early 1960s, Ward Cleaver represented an ideal, a father who listened carefully, spoke wisely, and led by example. Adding to that image, Beaumont had also been ordained as a Methodist minister, which made his on-screen presence feel even more authentic and grounded. Yet beyond that reassuring persona, Beaumont remained a deeply private individual. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he avoided the spotlight when the cameras were off. He was married and had children, but details about his personal life were rarely shared publicly. Over time, that discretion led to speculation, as observers tried to fill in the gaps of a life he chose not to discuss. However, much of that curiosity was never supported by clear evidence. After Leave It to Beaver ended, Beaumont gradually stepped away from Hollywood. He devoted more time to his faith, writing, and personal pursuits, including painting and occasional preaching. Friends and colleagues described him as thoughtful but reserved, a man who valued quiet over attention. His withdrawal from public life only added to the sense of mystery surrounding him. When Beaumont passed away in 1982, he left behind a legacy defined more by what audiences saw on screen than what they knew about him personally. In many ways, his story reflects a different era, one in which privacy was carefully guarded, and the line between public image and private life remained firmly intact. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new videos. See you in the next one.